So in this series, I'm going to be taking it upon myself to make an objective review of each of the dynasties and states that have ruled over China throughout its long and rich history. The reason I'm doing this is because so much culture, innovation, and history has come out of this general area that so many people tend to sweep under the rug. Right now, we're going to be taking a look at every China that has ever Chinaed. This is China Review. I hope you've enjoyed all the stability we've had in China during the first few dynasties, because that all comes crashing down this episode. That's right, today we're talking about the Zhou Dynasty. Now, the first thing that most people will say about the Zhou Dynasty is that they were the longest ruling dynasty of China. This in and of itself is a correct statement, but important to note is that the Zhou's consolidated power over China was relatively short-lived, and their hegemony over China was weak for most of their 800 years of rule. We'll go over the reasoning behind this later on, but for now we'll start off where we left off. It's around 1050 BC, and the Zhou kingdom has claimed the mandate of heaven and won the Battle of Muye against the Shang. They now rule China, as they've ruthlessly purged the Shang loyalists from the lands. What now? Well, the Zhou would instate en masse a land reform policy called Fenfeng. Fenfeng mandated that the land be conferred to the nobility of the ruling clan, and in turn these lands would become semi-autonomous states. This worked out fine for the first several decades of the dynasty, as the Zhou kept a centralized hegemony over the landowners. However, as members of the ruling clan drifted apart, these states would come to compete against each other for dominance, both politically and on the battlefield. For this reason, the history of the Zhou dynasty is split up into multiple periods, those being the Western Zhou, the first half of the dynasty's rule, and the Eastern Zhou, the second half, which itself is divided into two eras, being the Spring and Autumn era and the Warring States era. During the Western Zhou period, lasting from 1050 BC to 770 BC, things were relatively calm, and the only notable developments were the degeneration of the feudal system. The last king of Western Zhou would be King Yu of Zhou, who would become the source of political disagreement upon the dismissal of his former queen in favor of one of his mistresses. The former queen's mother would ally with barbarians to launch a successful raid on the capital of Fenghao, during which the king was killed. From 770 BC onwards, the capital would be moved eastwards to Chengzhou, now Luoyang, and the dynasty from then on would be known as the Eastern Zhou. Within the history of the Eastern Zhou, this first half is known as the Spring and Autumn period after the Spring and Autumn Annals, historical documents created by one of the feudal states which compiled and recorded the history of the dynasty contemporaneously. This period saw the destabilization of the Zhou stronghold over China and the heightened independence of the feudal kingdoms of China, who would begin to disobey the orders of their Zhou overlords and partake in independent conflict amongst themselves. For the bulk of the Spring and Autumn period, China would be ruled over by five powerful hegemonic states, these being the Shi, the Jin, the Song, the Qin, and the Chu. This period would come to an end as Wu, a barbarian kingdom, gained a stronghold in the south, and Jin, one of the former hegemons, would be partitioned among its neighboring states of Wei, Zhao, and Han. This would mark the beginning of the Warring States period in the year 475 BC. Now, the history from this point on is extremely complicated to get into, as it involves near constant wars over 2 centuries. So the easiest way to explain it is that essentially what happened was a huge fortnight battle royale throughout all of China. Who's playing? For the most part, it's between the 7 most powerful kingdoms: Qin, Qi, Chu, Yan, Hao, Zhao, and Wei, most of whom were previously around during Spring and Autumn. In the end, only one can win, and that one happens to be Qin, who unifies China and crowns himself under the new title of Huangdi, or Emperor, becoming the first in China's documented history. The Zhou dynasty would collapse without much consequence and at the nadir of their power along the way, falling to Qin shortly before their consolidation of power over all China. Despite the political instability of the Zhou dynasty, it would still come to be an extremely innovative time for Chinese culture and civilization. The Zhou dynasty can be seen as the peak of Bronze Age technology in China, with a lot of what we know today coming from inscriptions cast into bronze work. The Zhou dynasty also saw the evolution of the early Chinese script the Shang created, and was a revolutionary era in Chinese philosophy and literature, seeing the birth of some of China's cultural foundations, including Confucianist philosophy, with Confucius himself living through the Spring and Autumn period, and the birth of Taoism, which was originally invented by philosophers of the Warring States era. Sun Tzu also wrote his crowning work, A Guide to Military Leadership, entitled The Art of War, during the Spring and Autumn period, based on his experience with the army of Wu. As was the case with Shang, pure longevity seems to have gone a long way when it comes to the extraordinarily consequential nature of the Zhou dynasty. There is no way to overstate how important the Zhou dynasty is and was to Chinese history, culture, and society. The Zhou proposition of the Mandate of Heaven is directly responsible for the next several thousand years of Chinese dynastic rule. Zhou philosophers formed almost the entire basis for modern Eastern mysticism and philosophy, and their continued developments of the Chinese language are of extremely obvious importance. However, the Fenfang land reforms were an absolutely terrible idea, and the political instability that resulted was long-lasting and cannot be ignored, especially when you take into account the bloodbaths which would arise throughout the Eastern Zhou dynasty, especially into the Warring States period. It's for all these reasons that I'm going to give the Zhou dynasty a 6 out of 10. By and large, they did their best to differentiate themselves, but in the end it wasn't quite good enough. As it turns out, the greatest enemy of the Zhou leadership would be the Zhou leadership, and their abysmal decisions which would lead to the slow and prolonged collapse of their dynasty. Next on China Review, we'll be covering the Qin dynasty, China's first real empire. Will they bring a new future of peace and prosperity to the region? Spoiler alert, not really. More details on the next episode of China Review.